My name is Manoj Raithatha and you're watching smartandrelentless.com. I come from a Hindu background. We're part of the Asian community that travelled from India, from Gujarat, and then migrated to East Africa. We're economic migrants. And then, as you're aware, a number of the Asians actually moved from East Africa to the UK in the late 60s and the early 70s from Uganda, when actually the Asians were expelled. And so we're part of that community, raised Hindu, and I suppose my earliest memories of growing up here in the 70s in Watford is visiting the local Hindu temple with my parents. I'm a twin. My sister lives out in New Zealand now, and I have two children, my wife and I, age 13 and age 10. Well, it was the late 70s. It came as a bit of a shock to me when my parents suddenly told my sister and I that we'd be moving to Nairobi in Kenya. Things weren't working out for my parents here in the UK. The economy had meant that my father was struggling to find new employment. And so we went out to Nairobi with the dream of, my father's dream of joining his brother in the family business and making a go of a new life. Well, I was born in a Hindu family, and so for my father in particular, he was fascinated with the Hindu movement at a time when in the 60s and the 70s there were so many rock bands that were actually singing about the Eastern religions, and it was during that time that my father decided that he was going to be a committed follower. And I suppose as a Hindu he felt relaxed with the idea of my sister and I going to a Christian school, I suppose believing that all roads lead to God. And it was at this school in Nairobi in Kenya called Kavina School where I first heard the Christian message. And I must say, when I heard it, I was overwhelmed, totally overwhelmed with this story, because whoever heard the story of the king dying for his servants, or the creator dying for the created. Now my human mind just could not fathom why God himself would die for humanity. And I found myself, as you can imagine, with Hindu parents, I found myself having interesting conversations, debates in fact, with my parents, saying, look, there had to be something about this Jesus character who came not to die just for one tribe or nation, but for everyone. Well, I was fascinated with Christianity for a number of years during my primary school education, and I found myself occasionally I'd be looking at the Bible, taking an interest in Bible study in the school, really enjoying the opportunity to sing those hymns, with real gusto and passion. And I felt something in the air. I couldn't define it back then, but I felt different in that place. And actually, as I moved from that school, it was like that presence, that sense of something greater just went, just like that. Well, I suppose when I got to the age of 14, there were some economic problems, financial problems in our home setting, and my father wasn't earning enough money, and that was causing huge strain in the family home. And I saw my mother having to go and bake cakes and run cookery classes to make ends meet. And I suppose I made a decision at a very young age in my life. There was this God that I'd heard about. There was the Christian faith, that God was asking for commitment to serve him, to honor him, because he had come and rescued me from my sins. And on the other hand, there was the whole idea of business, of making money, of finding financial security. And I suppose I made a choice. I made the choice because my parents were struggling, and I thought to myself, what does Christianity, what does God have to do with living in the real world when there are financial problems? And so I really signed up very, very quickly to the whole idea of being a businessman one day, of being financially secure, of being my own boss, in charge of my own destiny. Many young people, they might go into something for one reason, but when you're actually involved, there are actually a host of other reasons why you're involved in it. Yes, for myself, I got into business because I'd realized that having money was important, being financially secure was important, having seen my parents struggle and actually seeing other people struggling financially. But actually, once I got involved in business, it became something totally else. It wasn't just about financial security. It was about greed. It was being able to buy all the things that I wanted. But actually, it went even further than that. It was about status. It was about recognition. It was about the fact that, look, if I'm a successful business person, then I'm going to be interviewed, then I'm going to be in the newspapers, and the people that know me within my community are going to recognize me. In fact, they're going to recognize me from the car that I drive, from the number plate that I have. And all these things started to become really, really important, the way people perceived me. I decided, well, money was the way forward. You know, there was no other option for me. I was going to one day be successful, and that involved making a lot of money. However, things didn't pan out that way. At the age of 16, we came back to the UK. Things hadn't worked out for my family, and I ended up in a boarding school in Portsmouth. And as you can imagine, my parents are still living abroad. They took a bit longer to come back to the UK, and here I was having this freedom to do what I wanted. And I found myself not studying very hard and spending too much time drinking beer with my schoolmates. The result was that I ended up not getting the grades that I needed to do economics at university. And I felt that economics was the pathway into making money. I thought it would be really important for me to understand how the economy works. But in the end, I found myself studying English at university. Why English? Well, it was kind of second option for me. And the thing is, I actually really liked English. And I thought to myself, well, look, even if I do English, I'm sure that I'll be creative in some way and find my way back into business at some point in my life. So actually becoming a teacher wasn't the plan. I know I'd gone to university and studied English because it was my second option. I hadn't got into university to study economics, but surely I was going to make it in business. But there I was, coming out of university with no other options, and found myself falling into teaching English in a secondary school. I quickly realised that teaching English wasn't my forte, and actually moved into teaching a bit of drama where I felt more comfortable. When I didn't go straight into business from teaching, I actually ended up writing for a while. I took a risk. In my primary school back in Kenya, I'd been told about the school motto time and time again, which is Fortes, Fortuna Juvat, which is about fortune favouring the brave. And as a teacher, I kind of felt stuck in that environment. And so I'd moved into drama teaching, thinking that that might be more my shape, my calling. And it was during that time that I started to take risks, and the big risk that I took was writing. I went back to university to do a part-time master's course in drama, and found myself directing a short play with a group of British Asian actors, taking them to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and finding that it won unexpectedly an award. I suppose it was at a time when there was great interest in Asian culture, and this play was charting the lives of a group of British Asian kids growing up and the issues that they faced growing up in an environment where they were caught between West and Eastern cultures. And it was at that time that it won this award and went on a national tour. And then what began was a brief spell in writing, in theatre first and then later for TV. But it was at one of the awards ceremonies. The TV series won a BAFTA and was later nominated for an international Emmy. And it was at one of those ceremonies, and I can't remember which one it was, when I suddenly realised that this really wasn't my calling. Yeah, it was great to have an award for the mantelpiece, but it didn't bring me any kind of satisfaction. In reality, it wouldn't have mattered if I'd not won the award, because I realised that I wanted to do something else. And then the opportunity that I'd been waiting for just happened. It was at a time in the UK when the properties were rising at an exponential rate, and I suddenly thought to myself, well look, there's some money to be made in property. And so I bought my first home in a scabby part of South London, and it did very, very well over the course of a few years. It doubled in value. And then what I did was, well, I suppose I thought to myself, I can make a business out of this now. And so I extracted the profits and started to invest in other properties that I would rent out. And so I became a professional landlord. I suddenly found myself moving out of the teaching and obviously the writing worlds to become full-time in the business world. And it was great. I could sit in cafes during the daytime, knowing full well that the properties that I bought and were renting out were actually bringing me an income. My property company did grow very, very quickly. I didn't envisage it happening that way, but it was during a period of huge, huge price growth in the UK property market. I started to see the rapid increase when I moved from buying properties that had already been built and actually buying off-plan properties. So going to a builder and buying properties from plan and then actually selling on those contracts before they were even built. And I loved this kind of business venture because it meant that, well, it meant I didn't need to get my hands dirty. I didn't need to be a landlord that was constantly having to redecorate and put up shelves and repair this and repair that, because I was buying brand new properties from plan. And yes, some of those I would go on to complete and own those properties, but a lot of them, I'd just be buying them at a big discount and then selling on the contract to other investors that wanted to buy in that block. I quickly found out that if I bought enough in a block, then actually that gave me control over the pricing. And then I quickly realized, look, if I buy the whole block, then I've got absolute control. And that's really where we ended up, buying whole blocks of apartments in cities around the UK and trading them on for a profit. And because we had that monopoly, that meant that we could govern prices, and that meant that obviously we became very, very rich very, very quickly. Yeah, when I became rich, it transformed me. Because I met my wife when I was a secondary school teacher, and so we'd been together for a very, very long time, and we lived a simple life. We enjoyed our house in South London at the time where we were living together, but then obviously things started to change because the house that we were living in got bigger and bigger and bigger. The car I drove changed, and the amount of money that I had that I could just literally just spend on whatever I wanted had increased so quickly that it really, really changed the kind of person I was. I think there was a period in my life, because I was reflecting on this recently, there was a period in my life when I looked at my life and I realized that I did nothing good for a long spell of my life because the love of money had absolutely consumed me. It had made me arrogant, it had made me ruthless. I wasn't a great husband, I was unfaithful in my marriage, I wasn't a good father. There was nothing good that I remember doing. I can't remember going on a train and asking someone if they wanted a seat. I can't remember opening the door for anybody. It had all become about me and about how rich I could possibly be. It was very, very difficult for my wife. Living with a man who she'd fallen in love with as one type of person, and someone who gradually was changing into somebody who was not a pleasant character. And so it was very, very difficult for my wife. I sometimes wonder, why did she stay with me? Why did she stay with me? Because it wasn't a great environment to live in at home when I would come in and, be angry about this or that, or ruthless, bringing my ruthless streak, in business into the home. So it was tough for her. I remember going on a holiday with my children actually, for about 4 or 5 years ago, and sitting down there in the lounge, we'd rented out this cottage, and watching a DVD, and my children saying to me, "This is the best day that we've had." It suddenly dawned upon me that day when I was watching the DVD that I'd spent many, many years not spending quality time with my children. I wasn't there for them. I wasn't watching the films for them. And in the same way, I wasn't there for my wife. I wasn't the supportive husband that I really should have been. Well, clearly money is important. We all need money. That's how the world functions. You need money to survive, to go and buy your food, to pay your bills, and so forth. But it's when we get to the love of money that things start to change very, very dramatically. In terms of my own life, the love of money I've come to see as highly, highly destructive, because the love of money started to change me as a person and started to destroy my character. It made me into something else. It started to destroy relationships, friendships, even relationships, with close family members, because my whole world then focused around making more money. And so everything else then didn't matter. People didn't matter anymore. I've got a friend of mine that often asks me if I'll sit down with him and talk with him how to make lots of money. And I keep on saying to him, there's no point in you chasing it because there's nothing there. Because I've been there at that place where I've loved money, I've had a lot of it, and it's not brought me any happiness whatsoever. Happiness is meant to be found in other things, in relationships, in faith, in a relationship with God. But people do buy into it, and often when people do get there, especially a lot of the wealthy people, they do start giving it away in the end. Well, some people do. Why? Because they realize, look, I've accumulated, I'm still not getting that buzz that I want, let me start giving it away. And then they suddenly realize, oh, there's a lot more satisfaction in giving it away than actually just holding it on to yourself. Well, 2007 was a brilliant year for us. We were doing really, really well, holding extravagant Christmas parties, buying really nice tailored suits, and having bought my home and other acquisitions throughout the country. And it looked like 2008 was going to be the big year for us. We anticipated huge profits, and my aim had always been to be in the Times Rich list, in that list of the 1,000 richest people in this country. And I was pretty sure that if things went according to plan, that I would be in that Times Rich list in 2008. But we all know what happened in 2008. Suddenly, the mortgage market collapsed because of the credit crunch, global financial crisis. And we found ourselves holding this business that it wasn't functioning anymore, because how are my investors going to be able to get their mortgages to buy the properties that they bought or contracted with myself? And so we found ourselves in an absolute mess, because the builders wanted to get their money, I was in the middle, and then my investors at the bottom of the chain who couldn't complete on their transactions. It was like living in an earthquake. That's the only way that I can describe it, because one minute your life is just going along as normal, and then suddenly it grinds to a halt where everything has changed. Suddenly your income goes overnight because there's no more money coming into the business, and yet the business had so many huge costs. And you've got mortgages, you've got private school fees, and there's all kinds of costs that you have outside of the business in terms of your family expenses. All the holidays that you typically would have gone to, Mauritius and places like that. Well, all of that just stopped overnight. If you can imagine that at one point, I could just walk into a shoe shop, and if I want to spend loads of money on a pair of expensive shoes, that's fine. The next thing I know, that I'm scouring bargain shops to buy stuff. It was that extreme, the change that happened. But it wasn't just the fact that my property company started to crumble because of the credit crunch. It was the fact that my son in February 2008 also became very, very ill. Now, my son had been hospitalized on many occasions with breathing difficulties. So we knew the drill. You take him to the hospital, he's given the nebulizer, they keep him in the hospital for a few days, sometimes for a week, and then he's back home. And often then I'd forget about it and just carry on back, in the whole world of business. But on this particular occasion, 2008, the nebulizer failed to work, and the nurses were panicking, and as parents, my wife and I were panicking, and before we knew it, my son was being rushed into resuscitation. I don't know if you've been in one of those situations, but basically the room was packed. There was nurses, there was doctors. It was seconds. Within seconds they were in there, fighting for his life, and his airways had shut down, so he was intubated to keep him alive, and there were all kinds of complications. I mean, what do you do in one of those situations? My wife and I found ourselves ushered into the room next door, and all the money that I had at that point in time wasn't going to help in our time of need. And so what do? You collapse to your knees, don't you? And you pray. I mean, how did I feel praying when I knew that I'd lived such a sinful life? Well, it just seemed, well, look, this can't be right. This can't be right, Manoj. You have sinned so much in your life. You've done so much wrong. There's a period of your life when you've done nothing good. You've been unfaithful. You've treated people badly. And now, in your time of need, what do? You collapse to your knees in prayer. But I had nowhere to go to because I was really up against it. And so we did pray. I think my wife prayed, and I kind of just supported her in the prayers. My son was eventually moved to St Thomas's in London because he was in critical condition, and he was wired up to machinery and drugs were being poured into him. And I remember the consultant coming to see him on the fourth day because he hadn't opened his eyes. He was on this machine, and they were doing all kinds of tests on him and trying to work out why his airways had shut down. And the consultant said to us on the fourth day, "Your son is not going to open his eyes. He's suffered a huge trauma." It was like one of those talks preparing us for the worst. And yet, what really impacted me, over those 4 days, is this Christian couple that I didn't know very, very well. They contacted us. Actually, they contacted my wife. We'd recently, made friendships with them, and they contacted my wife. I think my wife was in the ambulance or something like that, and she'd picked up the phone and said, "Look, well, I can't speak now. My son's ill." Well, obviously they found out that he was unwell, and so they started to call us over the 4-day period, praying for us and also getting their churches to pray. And so they had these people praying for my son that I didn't even know. And I was impacted by this. I mean, this was crazy. I'd never experienced such love and compassion before. And on that 4th day, despite what the consultant said, "Your son is not going to open his eyes," she did the ward round. The Christian couple are praying, churches are praying, and my son suddenly bolts upright in bed. Well, as you can imagine, there was elation, there was joy, there was tears. I wasn't the sort of person that cried much, but boy did I cry for 4 days. For 4 days crying because I didn't know if my son was going to survive, and then crying because he was alive. So it was tears of joy. And I remember turning around to the nurse and saying, "Look, is this for real? How can this possibly be?" And I remember the nurse saying to me, "Well, your son is fully drugged up. This really shouldn't be happening." It was a miracle. Well, what do you do in one of those situations? You've just seen what you think is God intervening, and my son is here. He's alive. Well, I had to go and say thank you. To the shock of my wife, I said to her, "I'm going to go to their church, this couple's church. It's not good enough that I go to their home. I'm going to go to their church, and I'm going to say thank you." I found myself going to church. It was a commitment that I'd made to myself, that it wasn't good enough that I went to the church just once. I'd have to go twice, so that this couple knew how thankful I was for their prayers. And so I went to church. It's the Emmanuel Church in Northwood. Great church, does great work in the local area. And I enjoyed the services. I was there for 2 Sundays. But I had no plan to go for 3rd Sunday. I just planned, well, look, I've said my thank yous, and now I'm going to just carry on my life as normal, get back involved in business again. And anyway, it was a credit crunch, so I was battling to keep my business going. But on the 3rd Sunday, the couple suggested the idea of actually going to another church. And I thought to myself, look, I don't want to go to church again. I've said my thank yous, but if I say no to them, then I'm going to look like I'm being rude. And so they invited my wife and my family, to Soul Survivor Church in Watford. And I remember going into this church, which is in a warehouse. It's part of the Church of England. And feeling something as I walked into the room. Well, I suppose feeling that kind of presence that I felt back in Kenya, in Kavina school, when I first heard the Christian message. Well, I was amazed with this feeling, this sensation, and I enjoyed the time when they sang worship music, when they sang songs in praise of God, and I really, really enjoyed the teaching, and I felt comfortable in that place. I felt at peace in that place, and I decided that myself, I'd made the decision that I would come back again. And how was I to know, a few weeks later, after coming a few Sundays, that I'd find myself going to the front of the church, deciding that I was going to make a commitment to Jesus. Now, I'd heard about Jesus, of course, in primary school, and I'd seen the cross on church buildings and around on necklaces, and I'd seen the cross in different places, but for the first time it suddenly started to make sense to me that this God was real. I'd seen God intervene in my son's life. He was alive now, and that Jesus really, really did die for my sins. And look, there was no other option for me. I'd lived such a sinful life, but the Christian message was a message of grace, that if I accepted him, I would be forgiven. I walked into church as one man, and I walked out as another. I wept for months. I wept for a good 6 months, just in different places, but just wept at the realization of God's grace, that despite however bad I'd been in my life, God had given me a second chance at life, and so I enjoy serving him today. Well, my newfound faith in Jesus was calling me to do things in a different way. And I looked at my property business, which I was battling just trying to keep it alive, and it did survive. It never went bust, but it's a shadow of what it used to be. It's a much, much smaller business. But in my heart, my kind of passion and love for business had gone, because it had all been based around greed, and I couldn't see the point of that anymore. There was a whole lot more to life. There was having a relationship with God and me doing what God was calling me to do, to make a difference to the lives of other people and to point people to God. That was really important to me. That, look, if I've encountered this grace, I really want other people to know that there is a solution to their problems, and that solution is God, and you can have a relationship with God. So business wasn't for me anymore. But I found myself over the course of time, while I was still running the small property company, meeting up with a vicar in the Church of England who did a lot of teaching on business as mission. And she started to tell me about Christians that ran businesses, and it wasn't just profit-based, it was actually businesses that made a difference to the lives of people. I mean, there's that businessman called Sir Titus Salt. I think it's in the 19th century when he built a mill up in the north of England. But it wasn't just a business. He built school, he built houses, he built so many facilities for his employees. He even built a church for his employees. And so I suddenly started to realize, look, I could actually combine my faith and business. In fact, God wasn't calling me to compartmentalize. He wasn't saying, look, just go to church on a Sunday and that's it. No, what he was saying is, look, give your whole life to me. Surrender your whole life to me. That is your sacrifice. That's your worship. Because I've come, and I've actually come to restore you and give you life. Now I want you to serve me. But now bring it all together. Everything that you do in the workplace, in the marketplace, combine it with faith. And the business that I run is a publishing house, a small Christian publishing house called Instant Apostle. And it's been a fascinating journey, because it's a business where the profits don't come first. And so I find myself actually publishing books that might not necessarily make huge profits, but can have huge impact in the lives of people. And I trust in God that actually, we will continue to make enough money to be able to publish books that are very, very niche, that might have a small market, but can have a huge impact in the lives of people. So that's how I kind of look at my business now. Is it impacting lives? At the same time, obviously, you then have to just keep an eye on the profits just to make sure that you can realize that vision. But I believe if it is God's vision and one is faithful and obedient in business, God will always make sure that it has enough to do what it's called to do. The vision of Instant Apostle Publishing House came very, very unexpectedly. I was in a cafe having a conversation with this vicar in the Church of England who had mentioned this idea of having a publishing business probably about 4 weeks before that, and said, look, maybe this is something that we should do together. We should set up a Christian publishing house. And I remember saying to her, look, I've got absolutely no interest in publishing. I know nothing about the industry, and I've got other things that I need to focus on, like my property company. And so I didn't have time. But there I was in this cafe, and I found myself having a conversation with this lady about something, and suddenly encountering the Holy Spirit, and which was the presence of God that just came upon me in that single moment. And I suddenly felt utterly convicted that God was calling us to set up a publishing house. Now, bearing in mind this lady really didn't bring up the subject again, had spoken to me about it 4 weeks earlier. This was a bit of a surprise, but it just happened just like that, a sense that God had spoken. And I remember saying to this lady, look, her name was Bridget, saying, I don't really want to do this, but I know that God has spoken. And she said, well, look, you don't need to do it. And I said, no, I do need to do it. God has done so much for me. This is my offering to him. I'm going to be obedient. And so Instant Apostle was set up and launched in 2012. In terms of, I suppose, what it really does, it's interested in new voices. It's interested in voices that will speak into the times that we're living in. So it's about prophetic voices. And because at the moment, when you look at Christian publishing, not all of it, but some of it is very much based around finding an author that can sell huge numbers of copies. And so it's commercially driven, as opposed to it being driven by the messages that we're meant to communicate for the time that we're living in. And so it's God's business. So it's a business that basically needs to listen to God, that needs to pray for the right books to come in, and for us to prayerfully discern those books that we release. And we pray and hope that those books are timely and the messages that God wants to communicate to the world that we live in. We publish a range of books. There's autobiographies, there's academic books, there's fiction books, there's children's fiction, there's fantasy fiction, all kinds of books. But a large part of what we publish are books that are topical for this precise moment in time. So here we are in the UK, and we're hearing so much about the refugee crisis in the Middle East and the impact that's having in Europe and here in the UK. And so at this particular moment in time, we are about to release 2 books that are engaging with this issue of the refugee crisis. And what these books are basically challenging us is, well, look, what are we going to do in response? As people who believe in God, are we going to do something in response? Are we as churches going to respond to this crisis? And so one of the books is just one person's story of being a refugee and finding hope and finding purpose through their faith in God and finding a new home here in the UK. The other one is a group of stories, 8 stories, of different people that have travelled from different parts of the world and found themselves here in the UK. And the final chapter in that book is then posing a question, a challenge. Well, look, what practical steps can we now take as followers of Jesus in our nation to help those people? Because Jesus was a refugee as well. So are we going to do something boldly, purposefully, to help people in need? So I'm still involved in property in a small way, not in terms of being a property trader. That's obviously something that I did for many years and obviously made a lot of money from it. But with the credit crunch happening, we were left with a property company which wasn't able to do that kind of trading anymore. But we were left with some properties in different parts of the country, and so what we're a landlord, and so we just rent out properties to people, and it's been wonderful to have this business because it's provided me with an income, a much smaller income than what I used to earn, but it gives me enough income to do the things that I feel God has called me to do. And one of the areas obviously is Instant Apostle Publishing House, which is obviously a very, very small business. But the other thing it's helped me to do is to work at the Evangelical Alliance here in the UK in a team called South Asian Forum. So it's a part-time role, it's a 2-day role here at the Evangelical Alliance. But what the South Asian Forum does, which is a team that I run, is it's a uniting and connecting body for Asian churches here in the UK. And there's probably about 400 Asian churches. Most of these churches are independent, so they're not part of mainstream denominations. And so what the forum tries to do is it tries to unite them, it tries to connect them so they can collaborate more effectively in God's work. So obviously a part of the work of the South Asian Forum team at the Evangelical Alliance is to support churches, and a number of these churches are seeing a number of Asians from different faith backgrounds. They might be Muslim, they might be Hindu, they might be Sikh, coming to faith in Jesus Christ and asking the question, well, look, how do I support those that are coming from a South Asian background? But yeah, we're starting to see in this country, obviously this can only be something that God is himself doing through the power of his Holy Spirit, but we are hearing some incredible stories. I mean, look at me, I was born and raised a Hindu, and there I find myself some 20 odd years later, after hearing the Christian message in a primary school, finding myself giving my life to Jesus. And a lot of other South Asians are experiencing miracles or encountering Jesus in a dream or a vision. But something supernatural happens to them that makes them question their old faith and embrace a new faith. The Christian walk is a journey, and I've been on this journey for the last 8 years or so. And it's been an interesting journey. There are times when I felt really, really close to God, where I feel I'm on fire for God, and I'm passionate about God. I'm passionate about the message of Jesus Christ. And there are other times when that incredible good news message that Jesus has died suddenly becomes diluted in my life, when it's not as central as it should be. And so I've been on this journey of being far, of being near. And what I found very, very helpful in this journey is to have a spiritual discipline. Have a discipline of praying. And I tend to pray throughout the whole day. So that's something that I'd say I'm pretty good at, because I do pray a lot. I'll pray when I'm in the car, I'll pray when I'm on the way to work, when I'm cycling, when I'm having a shower. So I'm praying very, very regularly throughout the whole day. But the other area which I find that is really, really helpful is reading the Bible. And I can't say that I read it as regularly as I should be. But I do read it regularly. I do read it normally 2 to 3 times a week. And those 2 to 3 days when I do read it, those days are totally, totally different. They're incredible days. I just feel God's presence more. When I'm faced with decisions, I find that God points me to verses in the Bible that can help me, so I get direction, I get discernment. But that is if I have a failing, that is it. I wish I could have the discipline to read it every day, because then I'd be having 7 days with some fascinating experiences. Interestingly, my life since I've been a Christian has been a challenging life, because I became a Christian at the beginning of the credit crunch, and so for the first few years I was battling away with trying to make sure that my business survived, because I'd given away personal guarantees, and I had 15 creditors that were after me, and fortunately we were quite a cash-rich business. And so at the time we were able to make compromises, but it was a very, very difficult period. I could have, been made bankrupt, but praise be to God that my business survived and all is well. But there's constantly challenges. If it's not business challenges, it's challenges to do with health or health of a loved one, or yeah, I'd say it's almost, sometimes it's almost daily. Things just don't work out the way that you want them to work out for a whole host of reasons. And during those times, what do I have to do? I have to go back to God, put my trust in Him, put my faith in Him. I mean, having read the Bible, what does God say? God says, look, pick up your cross and follow me. So He's not offering me an easy life. He's actually saying, look, if you follow me, it's going to be a challenging life. And it's true, isn't it? Whenever you do any kind of good, because ultimately that's what the Christian walk is. It's about doing good and pointing people to God. If you're going to do that, you're going to be attacked. That's just the reality of doing good. And people might not describe it in that kind of language of being attacked. But I know a friend of mine that, who helps out with young people. And he constantly finds his children are falling ill, or this is happening, or the washing machine is going in. All kinds of things constantly keep on happening. And yet the work he's doing is incredible. But it's so worth it, isn't it? Because he's impacting the lives of people. At the same time, there's suffering that goes hand in hand. I could say something here that people won't necessarily agree with. But this is my own personal perspective of being a Christian in business. It has to be, ultimately has to be, about pointing people to God. I mean, for me, I can't see the point of running a business if that's not what it's doing. Because as a follower of Jesus, I'm called to whole life ministry. It's not just about doing church on a Sunday. So if God has called me to be a business person, then my ultimate aim, my ultimate goal has to be to point people to God, to relationship with God, so that they can encounter the forgiveness of God, that they can be brought into relationship, so they can find new purpose, new meaning, and ultimately they can find life. And so that's really my sort of take on being a Christian in business. You invite God into the business. He's the CEO. You are not the CEO. It's not your business. You're just there to be a humble servant and to be obedient. And how does this sort of look in practice? Well, if I'm a Christian and I'm having a conversation with a supplier, well, it's through the way I engage in conversation. It's through the integrity that I hold, and the way that I communicate with the person about the love of Christ, that might ultimately make that person question their own life and think, well, look, is there a God out there? Should I actually have a conversation and see if He's for real? Having a faith has hugely benefited me in business, because before, all that my business was doing was making money for myself. So it was there purely to make me rich. But now I run Instant Apostle Publishing House, which is a kingdom business. It's a business that seeks to honor God and to serve God. Well, that's having incredible impact. I remember seeing a letter from a prisoner who had written a letter to one of the authors who had published a book through Instant Apostle, and the prisoner basically saying how that book had impacted him. And we hear these stories, not all the time, because we're not really connected up with the customers, because we use distributors and we use a large publisher that represents the books for us. But every now and then you hear a story of someone who's read a book and their life has been impacted by it. Now that, to me, is a worthwhile business. Well, I love reading autobiographies, and one of the books that I was given when I was a youngster at the school in Kenya was a book on the great evangelist George Whitefield. And I mean, he's somebody that's had a huge impact in terms of bringing the Christian faith to America in a very powerful way. Now, I know there were other people that were sharing their faith in America, but what George Whitefield did was extraordinary, going from one city, one town, one village to the next, preaching in different places and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And this was somebody that had had a faith for many, many years, but not a personal relationship with God. Because when he encountered that, then he suddenly realized, well, this is my calling. I those are the kinds of people that I sort of look up to. People like George Whitfield, people like John Wesley, who actually made huge amounts of money, but then gave all his money away. And he was a great evangelist. People like Billy Graham. I love the humility of Billy Graham, because what did Billy Graham do? Well, I remember when he got given this award, what did he say? And I can't remember what award it was, but he said something to the effect of, well, when I see Jesus face to face, I'm going to place this award at his feet. And it was a humble recognition that all that Billy Graham had done as an evangelist, preaching to hundreds of millions of people, I think over 1 billion people when you take into consideration his TV talks as well, he was able to say that and recognize that actually it was God that had done all of this, and he was really just a humble servant. So I wrote Filthy Rich for a number of reasons. I mean, primarily, there I was back in 2008, and I had a huge encounter with God, a road to Damascus experience. I was steeped in darkness. That's the only way that I can describe it. My life was, everything was destructing, everything was falling apart, and suddenly I found faith in Christ started to restore everything. My life was a bit like a puzzle that everything was kind of destructing, and then suddenly God was putting all the pieces back together again. But I suppose the other key reason why I've written this book is because I'm a businessman. That's what I've been doing for years, and I've found that through faith in God that I've learned a number of things that I want to share with other people in terms of how they run their own business, or if they're in the workplace. They might not be in business, but they're in the workplace, and they want to find out, well, look, how can I be more effective? How can I bring my faith into the workplace so that what I'm doing has greater impact in terms of shaping the world for good, impacting the lives of other people, which ultimately is far more important, is it not? People are far more important than making money or just doing a job for the sake of doing a job. Well, for all of those of you that have been watching out there, if I may just say a short prayer. I just pray, God, that you would bless each and every person that has watched this program, that you will be with them, that you will draw close to them. You know the needs that they have, and I just pray, God, that you would be with them in their time of need, that you'll give them wisdom when they need wisdom, and that you give them direction when they need direction. And ultimately, I pray that each one will have an encounter with you. In your name we pray. Amen.